The rain fell in sheets that night, whispering secrets to the cobblestones of an old forgotten street. Neon lights flickered weakly through the mist, their glow bouncing off puddles like fading memories. Inside a half-ruined music hall, two figures stood, facing each other as if time itself had stopped breathing. Xiao Zhan's eyes glistened with something between pain and recognition, while Wang Yibo's calm expression masked a storm within. The echoes of a piano piece long forgotten drifted through the cracked walls, a haunting melody that once tied their souls together. It was called Echoes of the Past. No one remembered who composed it, or why its melody could still stir hearts like ghosts rising from ashes. But for Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo, it wasn't just a song, it was their unfinished story. Years ago they were prodigies, two brilliant musicians whose friendship defined an entire generation of dreamers. Xiao Zhan, the poetic pianist with eyes that saw stories in every note. Wang Yibo, the silent violinist whose precision could make even silence weep. Together they were unstoppable. Their duets were symphonies that transcended fame, art born of shared souls. But one fateful night shattered everything. A competition meant to crown the best young musicians turned into chaos when Xiao Zhan's composition mysteriously vanished hours before the performance. Rumors spread, fingers pointed, and somehow all the blame fell on Yibo. The betrayal split them apart. One walked away from music entirely, the other vanished into obscurity. Years passed. The world moved on. But some melodies never die. They merely wait for the right moment to be heard again. Xiao Zhan returned to the old city in search of peace, not expecting the ghosts waiting for him. The once bustling concert hall was now a relic. Dusty seats, broken chandeliers, and walls heavy with memories. He ran his fingers across the old piano, pressing a key. It responded weakly, out of tune, but the sound carried a strange warmth. And then, behind him, a familiar voice. "You still play the same way," said Wang Yibo, emerging from the shadows. His voice was deeper now, smoother, carrying years of silence and restraint. Xiao Zhan froze. For a heartbeat he didn't move. The air was thick, charged. "You," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "You have no right to be here." Yibo stepped closer, holding something in his hand, a folded sheet of worn-out music. The corners were burnt, but the title was still visible. Echoes of the Past. "I never stole it," Yibo said quietly. "I tried to protect it." Thunder rolled outside, as if the heavens themselves were listening. Their confrontation was raw, electric. Xiao Zhan's anger clashed with Yibo's calm in waves that filled the room. Every word they spoke seemed to echo with years of unsaid truth. But as Yibo placed the old sheet music on the piano, something inside Xiao Zhan broke. He sat down and began to play. The melody rose like a ghost resurrected, soft, trembling, then fierce. Yibo hesitated, then lifted his violin and joined in. At first, the harmony was fragile, uncertain. But as the notes intertwined, the years melted away. The past, the pain, the betrayal, the distance, dissolved into music. The storm outside raged harder, lightning flashing through the cracked glass. Yet inside that ruined hall, the world stood still. For the first time in years they were together again. When the final note faded, silence reigned. Xiao Zhan's hands trembled over the keys. "Why now?" he whispered. Yibo looked at him, eyes softer than they had ever been. "Because this melody was never mine alone. I thought if I brought it back, maybe we could finish what we started." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of rain and hearts remembering. Then Xiao Zhan smiled faintly. "You still play too fast," he said teasingly. Yibo laughed. A rare, genuine laugh. "And you still overthink every note." The tension between them melted into something new. Something fragile, yet deeply familiar. That night, they decided to repair the old concert hall together. Each day, they returned to the place where their dreams had died. Dust became rhythm, silence became inspiration. Slowly, the ruin transformed into a sanctuary for second chances. People began to notice lights flickering from the abandoned hall. Some said they heard music in the evenings, beautiful, haunting, alive. Rumors spread across the city about two musicians who played with the ghosts of time. But no one knew their names. Until one evening the doors reopened. The concert announcement was simple. Echoes of the past, a performance by two souls. The hall was packed. Every seat filled, every heart waiting. The lights dimmed, and the curtain lifted. Xiao Zhan sat at the grand piano, wearing a black suit that shimmered faintly under the golden glow. Yibo stood beside him, violin in hand. His expression unreadable but radiant. The audience held its breath. The first note fell, gentle, then building, weaving nostalgia into sound. Xiao Zhan's fingers danced effortlessly across the keys while Yibo's bow traced lines of emotion through the air. Every measure felt like a heartbeat, every crescendo a confession. Halfway through, the screens behind them lit up, not with visuals but with memories. Snippets of their younger selves, laughing, creating, dreaming. The crowd gasped. This wasn't just a concert. It was a story unfolding in real time. The music swelled. The past and present collided in perfect harmony. When they reached the final movement, the melody slowed to a whisper. Xiao Zhan looked up at Yibo, their eyes locking across the stage. For a moment, they weren't musicians. They were two souls finally free from the weight of time. The last note hung in the air, shimmering like light trapped in glass. Then silence. And then applause. Roaring, endless, thunderous applause that shook the hall and every heart within it. Tears streamed down faces. Strangers embraced. The melody had done what words never could. It healed. Backstage, Xiao Zhan exhaled, smiling softly. Do you think they understood? Yibo looked out toward the cheering crowd. They didn't need to. It was never about understanding. It was about feeling. Xiao Zhan nodded. So what now? Yibo smiled faintly, adjusting his bow tie. Now. We start again. Weeks later, the world was still talking about that night. Critics called it a masterpiece reborn. Fans called it magic, and some whispered it was a love letter written in notes and silence. But for Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo, it wasn't about the fame. It was about the journey back to each other. The forgiveness, the rediscovery, the courage to play again after silence. They began touring quietly, visiting small towns and forgotten theaters, sharing the same haunting melody that had once broken them. Each performance carried its own heartbeat, its own memory. People described their music as something that reaches beyond time. Everywhere they went, hearts healed a little. One evening, after a performance in a quiet coastal town, Xiao Zhan sat by the shore, watching the waves crash. Yibo joined him, carrying 2 cups of tea. You ever think about what would have happened if that night never happened? Xiao Zhan asked. Yibo shook his head. No. Because then we wouldn't be here now. The waves roared softly in the background. The stars above shimmered faintly, like distant echoes of applause. The night deepened, and the city seemed to breathe again as the storm faded into a quiet drizzle. The broken concert hall stood like a living memory, its walls damp, its chandeliers cracked, and yet, within that ruin, something had awakened. Xiao Zhan sat motionless at the piano, fingers still trembling from the performance that had reignited a fire he thought had died long ago. Across from him, Wang Yibo leaned against the old stage frame, his violin hanging loosely by his side. His gaze distant yet heavy with unspoken emotions. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The air carried only the soft rhythm of rain dripping through the roof, each drop landing like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Then Xiao Zhan finally whispered, "Why did you keep the music all these years?" Yibo's eyes flickered. Because it was the only proof that what we had was real. Those words hit Xiao Zhan like thunder. He looked up sharply, his voice quiet but cutting through the air like a blade. "And yet you let me hate you for it." "I thought you needed to," Yibo replied, his tone calm, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped his bow. Sometimes hatred keeps a heart beating when forgiveness feels impossible. Silence again. The kind of silence that hurts more than shouting ever could. Xiao Zhan stood, walking slowly toward the edge of the stage. The moonlight seeped through the broken glass above, bathing the cracked wooden floor in silver. "I thought music was supposed to heal," he said, almost to himself. Yibo stepped closer, his voice low. "It can heal. But it can also haunt." Their eyes met. Two storms colliding, two worlds that once moved in perfect rhythm now learning to breathe the same air again. Then, unexpectedly, Yibo raised his violin once more. "Play with me," he said. Xiao Zhan frowned. "Now?" "Yes, right now." Without another word he began to play. A slow, aching tune, not from the past but something new. The notes were raw, unfinished, trembling with emotion. Xiao Zhan hesitated, then sat down, pressing a tentative key to join him. The sound that emerged was imperfect, fragile, but real. Every note carried memories. Laughter between rehearsals, late nights under neon lights, dreams whispered in dusty practice rooms. Their melody told a story of what once was, and what could be again. As the music filled the space, the rain stopped. Dust floated in the air like golden mist. The hall, once cold and empty, now pulsed with warmth, like a forgotten soul remembering how to feel. And for the first time in years, Xiao Zhan smiled. Later that night, the two of them found themselves sitting on the floor of the stage, backs against the piano, sharing a quiet moment. "You never told me where you went after that night," Xiao Zhan murmured. Yibo tilted his head back, eyes on the cracked ceiling. "Nowhere special. I just kept playing in the shadows. Mall bars, street corners, sometimes in subway tunnels." Xiao Zhan turned to him, surprised. "You, the perfectionist who couldn't stand an out-of-tune string." Yibo chuckled softly. "Perfection doesn't mean anything when no one's listening." There was a softness in his tone that made Xiao Zhan's chest tighten. He looked at Yibo for a long time, seeing not the rival from his memories, but the boy who once stayed up with him till dawn writing melodies they never finished. "You changed," Xiao Zhan said quietly. Yibo's smile was faint but real. "So did you." For a moment the world around them disappeared. Just two souls sitting amidst ruins, their shared silence more musical than any symphony. Days turned into weeks. They returned to that hall every evening, cleaning, restoring, and rebuilding what time had tried to erase. One night, as Xiao Zhan was polishing the old piano keys, Yibo walked in carrying an old reel camera. "What's that for?" Xiao Zhan asked. Yibo smirked. "For memories. I want to record this. Us rebuilding what was lost. The world forgot our story, but I don't want us to." Xiao Zhan smiled softly. "Still the sentimental one. Still the stubborn one," Yibo shot back with a teasing grin. They laughed, and the sound echoed beautifully through the hall. For the first time the place didn't feel haunted anymore. Felt alive. Every day their bond deepened, not through words but through rhythm. They practiced echoes of the past again and again, refining it until the melody felt like breathing. The notes no longer spoke of pain. They sang of healing, rebirth, and forgiveness. And yet, beneath it all, something unspoken lingered. Every glance they shared, every accidental brush of hands while turning a page, there was a quiet current of emotion, too deep to name, too strong to deny. Then came the night that changed everything. Xiao Zhan arrived late, the city already asleep. He entered the hall and froze. The lights were on, candles scattered across the stage. Yibo stood there in a black coat, his violin resting on his shoulder, a single spotlight illuminating him. "What's all this?" Xiao Zhan asked, his voice catching in his throat. Yibo smiled faintly. "A rehearsal for one last piece." "One last?" "Yes, the final part of Echoes of the Past. The ending we never wrote." Xiao Zhan hesitated, but something in Yibo's eyes told him this wasn't just about music. It was about closure, about trust. So he sat at the piano, heart pounding. Yibo began to play, and the melody was unlike anything Xiao Zhan had ever heard. It was beautiful yet bittersweet, like watching the sunrise after a lifetime of darkness. Xiao Zhan joined in, their sounds colliding and blending until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Every chord was a confession, every note a forgiveness, every crescendo a heartbeat. And when the final note fell, soft, fragile, trembling, the hall was silent. Tears shimmered in Xiao Zhan's eyes, and Yibo's hand lowered the bow slowly. "That's it," Yibo said quietly. "That's how our story ends." But Xiao Zhan shook his head, smiling through his tears. "No, that's how it begins." As dawn broke, the first light poured through the broken windows, casting golden reflections across the piano. Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo sat side by side, watching the sunrise. No words were needed. Their music had already said everything. And somewhere, deep within the walls of that hall, the echoes of their past lingered, not as ghosts, but as reminders that even shattered melodies can find their way home again. Dizzy Echoes of the Past is more than just a story. It's a symphony of forgiveness, rediscovery, and rebirth. Two souls once torn apart by misunderstanding, now reunited by the one thing that never betrayed them: music. Musical note, and as the final note fades, remember this: some echoes never die. They live in the hearts that dare to listen again. Clapperboard if you enjoyed this emotional continuation of Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo's Echoes of the Past. Make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more breathtaking stories that blend passion, mystery, and soul-deep connection.